The morning light slipped across the stone floor of Good Luckigsburg Castle, cool and pale, as if the war outside had finally tired of casting shadows. Through tall windows, the fjord lay quiet, so quiet that Paul Nitze wondered how a continent that had burned for 6 years could hold a moment of such stillness. He adjusted the chair opposite him, waiting for the man who had kept the German war economy breathing long after logic said it should have collapsed. Albert Speer entered without haste, dressed not like a prisoner, but like an executive arriving for a board meeting. He carried no swagger, only calculation, the same calculation that had shaped Germany's factories and fuel lines and forced labor networks. Nitze, now serving on the Strategic Bombing Survey, studied him with the steady gaze of someone who had spent months trying to understand why entire cities had burned, and yet the enemy kept producing tanks, planes, and ammunition in staggering numbers. Outside, Europe was quieting. Inside this room, two men sat with one question between them. Can aerial bombing truly break a modern industrial state, or does victory still belong to the side with greater factories, deeper resources, and overwhelming material power? The answer Speer was about to give would follow Nitze for the rest of his life. Paul Nitze had not begun his life in war rooms or interrogation chambers. Just a few years earlier, he had walked the polished halls of Wall Street, studying markets and balance sheets, with the precision of a man who understood how numbers shaped nations. But in 1940, when James Forrestal called him to Washington, Nitze stepped willingly into a different kind of calculation, one where the cost of a misjudgment was measured not in dollars but in lives. By May 1945, he carried the title of vice chairman on the Strategic Bombing Survey and the responsibility of determining whether months of destruction from Allied aircraft had truly weakened Germany or merely scarred its cities. Germany had surrendered only days earlier, yet the war was not over for the United States. Across the Pacific, Japan still fought with a ferocity that suggested the worst battles lay ahead. American planners feared a nightmare scenario, a ground invasion that could cost 500,000 American casualties. If bombing could force surrender, if it had worked against Germany, then it had to work in Asia. Nitze's task was to understand what bombing had actually accomplished, not what theory claimed it should accomplish. And to do that, he needed to look directly into the machinery of the German war economy. That machinery had a face, and it belonged to Albert Speer. Speer had stepped into power in 1942 after Fritz Tott's sudden death, inheriting a nation already buckling under the weight of a two-front war. What he built afterward seemed, at first glance, impossible. Under relentless assault from the air, Speer's factories produced more aircraft, more tanks, more ammunition than they had before the bombing began. The numbers puzzled Allied analysts. How could a nation under round-the-clock attack increase output? How could rail lines be severed, cities burned, and yet weapons continue flowing to the front? This was why Nitze had come. Sifting through captured documents and interviewing minor officials could reveal fragments of truth, but only Speer understood how the pieces fit together. He had been the architect of dispersal programs, underground workshops, emergency labor reallocations, and ruthless production priorities. He had kept the German war economy alive long after its industrial heart should have stopped beating. And now, for the first time, he was within reach, calm, cooperative, and determined to prove that he was a technocrat rather than a fanatic. Nitze approached those first hours of interrogation with the detachment of an analyst and the instincts of a man who had spent his life reading what people tried to hide. He sensed immediately that Speer saw this as a negotiation, a quiet bid for survival. The more valuable his knowledge appeared, the greater his chance of avoiding the noose at Nuremberg. Nitze accepted the unspoken terms. He would ask about production, not ideology, about refineries and rail choke points, not moral responsibility. The prosecutors could deal with guilt. Nitze needed answers. As daylight slipped across the table between them, one truth became clear. To understand the war's end, and to understand whether bombing could end wars in the future, Nitze would have to dismantle, piece by piece, the industrial world that Speer had built. Long before Paul Nitze had taken his seat across from Albert Speer, the skies over Germany had turned into a vast, permanent front. By 1943, the day belonged to American bombers and the night to the RAF. The pulse of war echoed from hundreds of aircraft engines, each one delivering the same message. Germany would be crushed not only by armies, but by industry turned into a weapon. Yet the message never seemed to land. Despite the inferno over Cologne, the firestorms of Hamburg, the flattened neighborhoods of Essen and Berlin, the German war economy kept growing. That was the puzzle that brought Nitze here. The Strategic Bombing Survey had mountains of data showing cities wiped from the map, but factories, some hidden, some scattered, some dug into mountainsides, still delivering weapons in astonishing quantities. Speer explained it with a calm that felt almost surgical. He described dispersal as if it were a simple architectural solution. Move engine plants to barns, assembly lines to abandoned mines, the machine shops to rural workshops so small that reconnaissance photos could not detect them. Shift production underground. Break a single assembly plant into a constellation of hidden pieces. If one site fell, another took its place. If rail lines were cut, trucks rerouted supplies through a patchwork of civilian roads. Every blow from the air was absorbed, redirected, adapted to. Listening to him, Nitze began to understand why the early bombing campaigns had failed to cripple German output. The Allies had struck what they believed were vital arteries: ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, aircraft factories at Regensburg, industrial districts like the Ruhr. But Germany had prepared its workarounds. Ball bearings could be stockpiled, precision parts could be substituted, supplies could slip through Sweden and Switzerland despite the blockade. The German war economy had been bruised, but not broken. Speer spoke about forced labor with the same distant tone he used for production charts. Millions of men and women taken from conquered lands filled the gaps left by German workers drafted to the front. They labored in factories that functioned because collapse was not an option. To Speer, they were numbers in an equation. To Nitze, the omission of human suffering said as much as the statistics. But there was something else beneath the surface, something darker, something Speer did not fully intend to reveal. They labored in factories that functioned because collapse was not an option. Even as he described the resilience of his industrial machine, he admitted, almost casually, that it was straining by 1944. And though production charts still climbed, Nitze heard the tension behind the numbers. A system can survive pressure. It can adapt, reroute, reorganize. Repairs took longer. Rail networks were harder to mend. Fuel shipments were delayed. By the time Speer reached this part of the story, Nitze sensed that the real collapse had not yet been revealed. The bombs had hit cities, factories, workers, and Germany endured. But every system has a point where adaptation turns to exhaustion. What he needed to know was the moment endurance stopped being enough. May 12th, 1944. When Albert Speer spoke the date, Paul Nitze felt the shift not in the room, but in the way Speer's voice settled into something heavier. This was not another statistic or a description of dispersed workshops. This was the moment the German war economy met the limit of its resilience. On that day, 935 bombers from the 8th Air Force struck Germany's synthetic oil network with a concentration no enemy had ever faced. The targets, Luna, Merseburg, Bolin, Politz, were not just industrial sites. They were the chemical heart that converted coal into aviation fuel. Without those plants, Germany possessed no meaningful source of gasoline. Not for tanks, not for training flights, not even for the trucks that carried food to the front. Speer described the aftermath plainly. April had produced more than 300,000 tons of fuel. By July, the total fell to a third of that. By September, it hovered near zero. No amount of dispersal or underground construction could mask the scale of the damage. The refineries burned too hot, the equipment too specialized to replace, the chemical processes too fragile to restart under bombardment. When repairs began, the bombers returned. When workers rebuilt, the Americans arrived again. It became a cycle of destruction that Germany simply could not outproduce, not against the overwhelming weight of American industrial production, not with a system that had no alternative source of fuel. As fuel vanished, the consequences spread like cracks across glass. Luftwaffe units received aircraft they could not fly. Pilot training hours collapsed to levels that guaranteed inexperience. Squadrons faced American formations with men who had barely lifted off a runway before their first battle. The engagement stopped looking like combat and began to resemble execution. On the ground, panzer divisions endured a different kind of paralysis. Commanders rationed fuel so tightly that crews trained on simulators made of plywood, unable to burn gasoline for real maneuvers. When the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, was launched, its survival depended on capturing Allied fuel dumps. The engagement stopped looking like combat and began to resemble execution. Speer described this with a detached clarity. The armaments miracle had continued even into 1944. Germany built tanks it could not drive, aircraft it could not fly. When the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, was launched, its survival depended on capturing Allied fuel dumps. When that gamble failed, entire armored units died, standing still. Perfectly functional tanks, engines intact, guns loaded, crews ready abandoned for lack of a few gallons of gasoline. When fuel ran out, the entire war machine, no matter how impressive on charts, became steel without purpose. The collapse was not just material, it was mathematical. Germany built tanks it could not drive, aircraft it could not fly. Then came Hitler's Nero Decree, ordering the destruction of Germany's remaining infrastructure. Bombing cities had done little. Bombing factories had hurt but not broken the system. But the lesson for the strategic bombing survey was unmistakable. It was oil, only oil, that brought the machine to its knees. It was not about bombing patterns, transportation, choke points, or refinery repair times. It was about the one factor no bomb could destroy: the industrial balance between nations. "What did you believe America could produce?" Nitze asked. For the first time, Albert Speer hesitated. In the early years of the war, he explained, Hitler and his senior commanders dismissed American industry as a political illusion, boastful speeches meant to reassure Britain. They believed the United States was divided, isolationist, weakened by the Depression. The production targets Roosevelt announced in 1940: 60,000 aircraft, then 125,000 were considered impossible. Germany assumed those numbers were fantasy. Then Speer saw the reports. Not propaganda, not projections. Numbers. The reality of American industrial production was beyond anything the German leadership had imagined. More than 300,000 combat aircraft built between 1,941 and 1,945, 88,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, thousands of naval vessels, Liberty ships rolling off assembly lines faster than U-boats could sink them. A single American plant, Willow Run, produced a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Not days, minutes. Speer told Nitze that when he saw the full American data in late 1943, he understood with absolute certainty that the war was lost. No tactical brilliance, no wonder weapon, no ideological fervor could offset the disparity. The German war economy was sprinting at full speed. America was running on a track that had no end. For Nitze, this admission was more than a historical footnote. It became a framework for the next 40 years of American strategy. As he shaped the Marshall Plan, drafted NSC 68, and later negotiated arms control, the memory of Speer's confession remained a quiet compass. Great power conflicts are won not only on battlefields, but in factories, shipyards, and supply chains. Other nations absorbed the lesson as well. The Soviet Union tried to match American output through massive industrial expansion and collapsed under the economic weight in 1991. China took a different path, integrating into global trade and building a manufacturing base that transformed it into a 21st century industrial superpower. The strategic bombing survey's findings echoed across later wars. Vietnam repeated the mistakes of World War II, bombing morale and infrastructure without striking irreplaceable resources. The Gulf War, in contrast, applied the lesson precisely. Target oil, power, transportation. Break what cannot be replaced, and a modern military collapses. To Nitze, this was the core truth Speer had given him. Industrial capacity is not the background of war. It is the decisive front. When the week of questioning ended, the two men parted, one returning to Washington to shape the post-war world, the other preparing to face judgment. On May 23rd, Albert Speer was arrested with the rest of the Flensburg government. 2 years later, he stood in the dock at Nuremberg, no longer the polished technocrat Nitze had met in good Luckexburg, but a defendant confronting the wreckage of a regime he had served with ruthless efficiency. Speer crafted a careful image there. The good Nazi, the apolitical architect who claimed to have been seduced by Hitler's charisma but ignorant of mass murder. He accepted a measured share of responsibility, just enough to appear honest, never enough to admit his role in the Holocaust. The tribunal sentenced him to 20 years, and he served every day of it. Only decades later, when hidden documents and memos emerged, did historians uncover the truth. Speer had known far more than he admitted. He had overseen expansions at Auschwitz. He had managed a vast network of forced labor. The humanitarian mask was a masterpiece of post-war self-preservation. Yet in that room, at Good Luckexburg, Paul Nitze could not see the full moral contour of the man across from him. What he did see, what he carried for the rest of his life, was something different. The clearest articulation ever given by a senior German official that modern war is not merely fought with courage or strategy, but with production, energy, logistics, and the ability to replace what is lost faster than the enemy can destroy it. For Nitze, this insight did not remain confined to World War II. It shaped the Marshall Plan, informed NSC 68, guided nuclear posture debates, and influenced every calculation of American power during the Cold War. Long after the interrogations ended, the lesson remained unchanged. A nation's industrial base is its most reliable form of deterrence. Today, as new powers rise and old rivalries stir, the questions Nitze asked Speer still echo. Which nations can sustain a long conflict? Which can replace aircraft, ships, microchips, fuel, and ammunition at scale? which can absorb losses and continue. These questions, quiet, technical, unglamorous, often decide the fate of nations long before the first shot is fired. If you found this story meaningful, consider joining us for future chapters of military history. Each one reveals not just the battles that shaped the world, but the unseen forces, economic, industrial, human, that determined how those battles ended.